I don't know how many of you are history people and you enjoy history, but if I were to ask you, what are the current issues of today? What are some of the current issues we face in our country? Transitional stuff. What else? Abortion. What else? The economy. What was that? Immigration. That's right. Government. Now, these are the issues we face today. We're going to come back to those in a second. But they've changed throughout history. In the early church, so this is when the church was just beginning, the first 150 years in the Roman Empire, the biggest social issues of the day were that social hierarchies were being redefined. It was particularly being redefined in regards to women because women were gaining more power in the Roman influence and in marriage and in families, and so it was creating all kinds of issues. There was this greater disparity in the Roman Empire during this time. The rich were becoming richer, the poor were becoming poorer, and on top of all that, they conquered entire nations, and slavery was such a big deal, and there were so many slaves from so many countries that the assimilation of all that into their culture was creating all kinds of problems. Very different social issues than we have today. Now, if you fast forward 1,000 years and go to the late Middle Ages, it was a whole different set of social issues. In those times, it was this whole idea of war and unrest because the peasant class, which had been for 1,000 years being oppressed, were saying, we don't want to do this anymore. They were starting to resist, and so there was this whole idea. They were dealing with the Black Death, which killed a third of the world's population. Crazy stuff. They were dealing with all that. What does that look like? And the power and the monarchy were declining in influence, and they were on the eve of the Reformation. Whole different set of social issues. What about in the U.S.? Well, if you go back in the U.S., in the 1800s, the biggest issues of the day were, of course, slavery abolition, right? That's what led to everything from Civil War to all the different things that were going on in there. And another big one, I didn't know this, was urbanization. Because for the first time in the history of this country, people were leaving the farms and moving into the cities. And they were having to deal with the cities just exploding with growth. They didn't know what to do with that as a country. And then if you move forward into the 1900s, they had a reformation of the children's labor problems. Did you know that child labor was still an issue in the 1900s? I didn't. It's crazy. There was issues. They were still taking advantage of children. They had to reform that. Prohibition of alcohol, which led, ironically, to the prohibition. Women's voting rights became an issue. Exposing corruption and election reform. You're thinking, really? Interesting. All right. What if we go a little bit later, 1950s? Our involvement in the world became a huge issue because we went from the Korean War to the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of conflict over which role do we play? How should we do this? Some of you are old enough to remember this. There was the racial equality. The whole civil rights movement was an enormous social issue. And there was, and this is when a radical increase in taxes began because governments began funding things in a whole new way. Big social issues. What about today? You guys mentioned a bunch of them, right? Immigration, abortion, government mandates like vaccinations and other things, racial sensitivity, gender diversity and equality, the drug epidemic, poverty, inflation, climate change, all kinds of things. Now here's what's interesting. The reason I give you this is social issues change over time, but never in the history of humanity have we had the access to and the platforms for talking about this stuff. And you know this, because if you're on social media, you realize that every single person has a platform. Social media has redefined how we communicate, and COVID has reshaped how we work, how we play, how we worship, and the culture we're living in is changing as rapidly as it's ever changed in the history of the world. Some of the issues are brand new. Some of them are very old and are just being recycled over again. And every person responds differently to the social issues of the day. So the question is, as a follower of Jesus, how do I respond compared to everybody else? I learned something about myself a few years ago that surprised me. Maybe you can identify with this. I would, as I watched the news, I listened to podcasts, I would listen to sermons, I would have discussions with my friends, I would read books, I'd read articles, I'd be on social media, and I realized something that my wife has known for decades. I have an opinion about everything. Did you know that? Can you identify with that? Some of you are like, no, I don't have any opinions. Others of you are like, yeah, that's me, okay? Well, maybe that describes you, maybe it doesn't. But here's the thing. We all respond to social issues and cultural issues differently. One of the ways that we respond is to ignore it all or resist it all. There's a great quote by a gentleman named Daniel Greenberg. He was actually a journalist and author in the last century. And he said this. He said, whenever culture has gone through a radical change, as ours has, from the industrial age to the information age, there are people who will deny that things have changed, they resist it, and they refuse to change. That's why it's easy to talk about the good old days. That's right. See, you all know that. Because we think, well, I don't want it to change. This is all stupid. All these young people have no idea what's going on, right? It was better in the 50s. It really wasn't. It was just different. Now, that's one of the ways we do it. We resist it. We deny. We don't want it. But another way we respond is actually trying to condemn the culture. We say, you know what? It's not good. We want to manipulate it. I need it to conform to my worldview, which we're going to talk about in a second. And so we push really hard to make it like we want it. And I wonder if those are the best approaches. Because what those do is they leave us reacting to culture. You know the difference between reactionary and proaction, right? Like reactionary is when something happens, we just get up in arms, we react, we get angry, we shoot back, we fire back, we try this. That if we approach culture like that, we become very reactionary. And I wonder if for a Jesus follower, it's not supposed to be like that. And so what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks is taking a different approach. And I think the question that we better would be served with is, how do I, as a follower of Jesus, engage with culture? Engagement being very different than reaction. Engagement is a very deliberate, thought-out attempt of how do I respond and interact given the way the world looks around me. What does that look like? Because as followers of Jesus, we're supposed to follow his example in engaging with the culture. We're not supposed to conform, but we're not supposed to run and hide either. We're not supposed to fight in the wrong way for this. We're to be who Jesus called us to be in the midst of this crazy, chaotic world. So what does that look like? I mean, how is the church supposed to respond to that list of issues we had before? How are you supposed to respond? What am I supposed to believe about it? What's right? What's wrong? What's the connection between what I believe and how I act, or how we act? I mean, how do I connect with my neighbors or my friends, or with those people that I disagree with, who I think are wrong, whether they be church people or unchurched people? Well, for the next 5 weeks, we're going to go over this, 6 weeks, including today, of how do I, as a follower of Jesus, engage with culture? What should I believe or say or do in response to everything that's happening? How do we engage with a culture whose value system is completely different from the one that most of us espouse? So I do this with a little fear and trepidation, but I hope this will be encouraging and challenging for you. Let me begin by a question. What are your filters? What are the filters by which you see the world? You know, in the movie, do you remember the movie National Treasure? How many people saw that one? In the movie National Treasure, Nicolas Cage movie, he has this set of these glasses. You remember these glasses? And they had all these different colors, and you put them in different combinations. And the reason was they would filter out certain colors of light and allow them to read the secret map that was on the back of the Declaration of Independence and follow it, to the treasure. It was the filter by which they read that. What is that filter for you in regards to the world around you? Is it a theological filter? Is it a political filter? Is it a social filter? Maybe a family-based filter? A combination of all of those? Or maybe think of it this way. Your filter could be thing is like when you get a jigsaw puzzle and there's a picture on the front that allows you to put all the pieces together. What does that picture look like for you? That allows you to take all the pieces of culture and put them together in a way that makes sense to you. What is that picture? Or, if you want another metaphor, what's the foundation under which everything you do in your life is built? Here's why this is important. Because before we can engage with a discussion of how the church and how we as Jesus followers will engage with the culture, we have to understand this truth, that every single person filters culture through their worldview. Now, how many people have heard the term worldview before? Right? Probably most of you, right? Worldview. You've probably heard it. Everybody has one. A worldview is simply how we make sense of the world. That's all a worldview is. It's how we make sense of the world. And so you're going to stick with me because I want to move a little bit into teacher mode, okay, lecturer mode here, because I want to talk about this and stick with me because this is really important. A worldview is comprised of 4 things. By the way, I could teach you an entire semester on this, but I'm going to do this in 5 minutes. A worldview starts out with assumptions. In other words, there's certain things that you or I presume to be true or to be real. They're things that come out of our upbringing, our background, our history about, everything for the purpose of life, why humanity is here, who is God. Those are all things. And you might have an assumption that 99% of the world are stupid and dumb drivers. Right? That's just something you fundamentally believe. Or maybe you have the assumption that government at its root is a bad thing because they're tyrannical and oppressive. I don't know. There's all kinds of assumptions. They can change over time, but we all have them. Okay? You drive into the parking lot at Applebee's before you turn the corner, Stein Highway, there's someone standing there. And they're dressed ratty. They got a cardboard sign that says, "I need money." The assumptions of your worldview will come into play in that moment. What do you think about them? What is your assumption? They need to get a job. Why are they doing this? They're probably just manipulating. No, they're really in need. I really need to help them. It's very different because you're bringing a whole set of assumptions to play. And here's why this is so important. Your assumptions begin before you begin to take a rational and reasoned approach to life. They don't come after, they come before. So when you think, no, well, I think through my worldview, I'm a very rational person, you already started with a set of assumptions that came out of your life before you ever did that. Then there's the second piece. We have these assumptions, and then we have our commitments. The commitments is really the assumptions that we have that we are committed to. We never come to anything in life dispassionately, unemotionally, and logically. We all think we do, but we don't. We are invested in our worldview. They come out of our passions. They come out of what we think is really important. And you know this because the second you talk about something that matters to you, what happens? Your voice goes up. You get more engaged. You lean in. You get more passionate. You're willing to argue. Well, why? Because your emotions and everything you feel is wrapped up in that worldview. You are committed to those assumptions. What does this do? Well, this creates a framework. So we take all those assumptions, those things we're committed to, and it builds us these filters, that framework by which we see the world. It's how we interpret information. So we gather knowledge. We're always gathering knowledge. Our worldview is, we're always bringing in more information, either because of something we read, something we encountered, some people we met, a conversation we had, something we studied. We always have this information coming in, but it comes in never neutral. It comes through a framework that we've already put into place. There is always an application of your values to information. Don't kid yourself. When you evaluate culture, it is never neutral. Let's go back to our example. You see that person standing there with the sign. And you have some assumptions, and you have them deeply held because you have watched people abuse this kind of thing for years. You heard people say, this is a problem in Seaford. They're not even from Seaford. When they're done begging, they get in their SUVs and they drive back home. It's all a scam. And you've heard this and you've seen this. And you knew somebody once who knew a person who did this, and you kind of had all this information. And you build all this into your framework so that when you see them, that's what you think. Which then leads to the last part of worldview, which is, what do you do? Because that framework then determines how we respond. And we drive right on by, we ignore, whatever our worldview does impacts how we respond. Now let me give you another example. If you grew up in a home with a harsh or abusive parent or parents, let's just use this, someone does that. You develop certain assumptions growing up because through repeated behavior and reactions from your parents, you decide that, or begin to come to the conclusion that people are far more interested in what you can do for them than they are in you. Because your behaviors trigger certain things. And if you did the right things, they were nice to you. And if you did the wrong things, oh man, your parents were going to be, all over you in probably a very negative way. And so what happens is you don't think of this when you're little, but you begin to think this. Now you become older and you start to go through this and you begin to view people with suspicion. You become a little bit cynical. And even if you come to follow Jesus, you're like, yeah, I don't know. And it's just a lot easier for me to believe the worst about people than the best about people. I'm never actually going to share the deep, deep, dark secrets of my heart. Everybody gets kept at some level of an arm's length because people generally aren't trustworthy and they just want me for what I can give, not because they love me. And so I move from relationship to relationship and never fully invest myself in one place at one time. Do you know what all that is? That's this. Assumptions that we become committed to that provide the framework for our life that dictates how we live. No one will come to the current issues we're going to talk about or social problems without a worldview. You did not come to your worldview because you dispassionately sat down, read Scripture, and said, this is what I believe. It doesn't work like that. You're bringing everything into this. It is not just based on totally objective truth. And that happens because it happens individually and in community. Do you know that the Apostles' Creed, which we read and sang, was an exercise by the early church that says we as a community need to set our worldview. What do we believe? Let's decide and recite together. All this matters because all the issues of the day, and it doesn't matter if it's climate, immigration, abortion, gender identity, government involvement, it doesn't matter. It's shaped by your worldview. So, what you think is a collection of all the assumptions that you've gathered over time, that you've become committed to, that you've put into this framework that you use to engage with culture. And do you know what the problem is with that? So has everybody else. That's why there's conflict, which is why you should come on October the 15th to conflict training. No, that's side thing, okay? So here's what I want you to do. As we go through this series, I want you to be open. I want you to be open to constantly re-examining your worldview. Why do you believe what you do? Really? What makes you act the way you do? Why are certain things more important to you than other things? Now, before we go further and before we start jumping into Scripture, make a couple of notes. Here's the first. Not all worldviews are equal. Just because everybody has one doesn't mean they're all equally valid. Hitler had a worldview. Didn't make it right or good. There are people who have a worldview that the earth is flat. Doesn't mean they're correct, right? So not every worldview is equally coherent, thought out, or right, or even just or moral. So let's understand that. We're not trying to say they're all the same. Everybody's got one, but they're not all equal. Here's the second thing. We are inconsistent in living out the ideals of our own worldview. All of you. Nobody is utterly consistent in this. I'll give you another example. Let's say there's a lady named Joan. She works in a humanitarian aid. She spends her days in the inner city with people who struggle with drugs and broken families and all this. And so when she's working with them and she's communicating with them, she's always communicating something to them that's of one of her core values, which is all people matter and have value. It's her core value. And then she gets in the car to drive home. And it happens all the time. It starts out with a, come on. And then it elevates to, get out of the way. What are you doing? You're so stupid. 2, you shouldn't even own a car. You're a waste of space. And the words that are coming out of her mouth are, and you say, okay, so what is it? Is every single person fully valuable and worth something? Or only in certain situations? We do this all the time. And by the way, I wouldn't feel bad about this. This is something that's normal, but it means that we have to have the humility that says, I need to consistently examine my worldview and what it does. That's number 2. Here's the third thing. Our worldviews are constantly changing. They never are static. You know this because what you see about the world is not the same as what you saw about the world 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. For some of you, 6 months ago. COVID changed a lot of people's worldviews on a lot of different things. Right? This is what happens. That's okay. And so when we go through this whole series, it's a very long preamble, but I think you need to understand because how does this fit with a Jesus follower? Our goal is to align our worldview with the law of Christ. That's what we're trying to do. That's what Jesus invites us to do. That's what he calls us to do. is to align our worldview, all those assumptions, commitments, behaviors, framework, with the law of Christ. Now, does anybody know what the law of Christ is? It's a term that doesn't get talked about a lot in church. I didn't hear about it growing up. I think it's a really important one, though. The term was actually coined by Paul. And it was coined to summarize what Jesus himself had said. You're familiar with it. In Galatians, he says this: carry each other's burdens. This is probably where you've heard it before and what you remember it from. Carry each other's burdens, and this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Well, what is the law of Christ? What's he referring to here? Well, when Jesus was approached, you all remember the story. If you've been in church, you remember the story where someone came to him and said, "What's the greatest commandment?" Do you remember what his answer was? Right? He said, "The most important one," answered Jesus, "is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength," which everybody knew. And then he said the second, not second in importance, but equal value, but the second part of that is love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these. That is the law of Christ. That's why our mission here at our church is to increase in how we love God, love each other, love the world. It's the law of Christ. And then, just to make it a little bit tougher, right before he died, he says, "By the way, I'm giving you a new command to love each other." But that wasn't a new command because he had already told them, right? Love each other. But remember what it was? Love your neighbor as yourself. Then he upped the ante and said, "No, actually, love your neighbor as yourself is good, but I want you to love each other the way I loved you." The law of Christ should be the primary shaping tool for our worldview, which places other people before me, just like God the Father put me first. So I would say it this way: the law of Christ is to blank one another the way God through Christ. So let's take a look at this. To love one another the way God through Christ loved me. How about this? To honor one another the way God through Christ honored me. To respect one another the way God through Christ respected me. To accept one another the way God through Christ accepted me. You see how this goes? We can continue to move on. So here's the question we're going to be looking at over 5 weeks as we engage the culture. Does my worldview, and remember, worldview is not just opinions, it's not just beliefs, it involves everything all the way up to actions. Does it align with the law of Christ? Is the way I believe, think, act, or interact lining up with the law of Christ? And when it doesn't, we need to make an adjustment. We need to change our worldview. Either our assumptions, our commitments to them, to the framework, to what we do. That's what we're going to want to look at. Now, there are 3 dangers that happen. And I think these are 3 dangers that will stop us together, collectively, from doing this well. Because if we want to align our worldview with the law of Christ, to do what God through Christ did for us, if we want to align ourselves, there are 3 dangers that we're going to fall into that will prevent this from happening. Here's danger number 1. Thinking that our theology alone is sufficient to engage with culture well. Anybody uncomfortable with that statement? Paul, who wrote, as you know, most of the a lot of the New Testament, knew and practiced a theology consistent with Scripture better than any of us ever have. He not only knew his Bible, which for him was the Old Testament Scriptures, he studied it, he understood it, he memorized it, he lived it, he developed it in his life. And then when he came to know Jesus, he took all that intellectual power and prowess and he brought it into this understanding Jesus. And his theology was amazing. He's the one who wrote things like Romans and Galatians that taught us everything we need to know about theology. He was the most theologically oriented truth person that you can possibly imagine. But here's what he wrote with regards to the law of Christ. Even though I'm a free man with no master, in other words, Jesus has changed all this, all those things. This is the way it is. I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who followed the Jewish law, I too lived under the law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who were under the law. When I'm with the Gentiles who don't follow the Jewish law, I live apart from the law, so I can bring them to Christ. And if you were reading this and hearing it in its original context, you're like, okay, what's going on, Paul? You're just going to do everything, be anything to anybody? Like, aren't you standing up for anything? Like, don't you say, look, this is the right way, and this is what Scripture says, and this is what I should do? It's like, it sounds like you're saying, Paul, that none of this matters. Remember, he understands theology better than any of us. But he continues. Look what he says. Despite all of that, here's what he says. I'm not ignoring the law of God, but I obey the law of Christ. When I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness because I want to bring the weak to Christ. And catch this. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and to share in its blessings. Our theology, our knowledge of truth by itself is always insufficient to engage well with culture. So hear what I'm saying. Do you know why that is, by the way? Because laws in and of themselves are never inspiring. No one has ever been inspired to greatness by following laws. The law says I have to do this, this, and this. I'm going to do that, and it's going to make me a great person. No one ever does that. You know what laws are? It doesn't matter if it's civil laws, criminal laws, or the biblical laws of the Old Testament. Do you know what they are? They are the minimum standard that which we are supposed to live. When God gave the law, it was like, here's the minimum standard. This is how you guys are supposed to live. It doesn't actually inspire you to do anything great or amazing or lean into it. And you know this because you can follow every traffic law. That does not make you a courteous driver. And you can pay all your taxes to the IRS. That doesn't make you a generous person. Right? There's something more about this. And that's why when Jesus came along, he said, look, it's bigger than that. It's better than that. It's broader than that. That's why we have the law of Christ. Paul says, look, I have rights. I could choose to do whatever I want, but I'm going to choose differently because my focus is on other people and seeing them come to know my Savior. And so everything I do will be wrapped around that. Now, hear me again clearly. Theology, truth, what we believe, it's critically important. And we're going to talk about that over the next 5 weeks. But by itself, it turns us into Pharisees. Because that leads us to our second danger. Forgetting that our tone, our posture, and our approach matters. If you are not a follower of Jesus, if you haven't bought into this and you don't care, then have at it, right? Write what you want on social media, post whatever you want on Facebook, laugh at whatever jokes you want, say whatever you want, do it. That's okay, you're not a follower of Jesus. But if you are a follower of Jesus, you have zero wiggle room. Because Jesus prescribed this. He said, this is how it's supposed to be. He modeled it, a life full of grace and truth. And Paul, when he's writing to the ancient church of Philippi, he told it this way. He said, do everything without grumbling or arguing. Everything. Not just some of it, all of it. So that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault. And I love this description, in a warped and crooked generation, right? Which everybody says, yeah, that's today. Well, it was back then too, 2,000 years ago. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. Do you catch what he's saying? Do you know what makes you shine like stars in the sky? It's not that you've given up truth because they're holding firmly to truth. It's that they're doing that in a way where their tone and their approach and their posture shine out. You see how he puts them together? And when we forget that our tone and our posture matter, we have problems with worldview change. And then he says this, then I'll be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. And I think that's fascinating because the implication is simply this, that if they act in a way that's un-Christ-like in their rhetoric or their actions, then all his teaching was worth nothing. Ooh. How we engage culture matters. Here's the third one. This one's a tough one for us. Trying to win. It is so easy to move into a posture of win-lose in our culture. And in order for us, the church, the Christians, to win, they have to lose. Again, in relation to the law of Christ, look what Paul says. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. In other words, you're free. You don't have to be obliged to all these things that they did in the Old Testament, all the ways the law used to be. You don't have to do that. So you're free. Do you know what I want you to do with that freedom? I want you to argue. I want you to win the rights of the church everywhere. He doesn't say that. He says, don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh, yourself. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. And then he references the law again. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. For Paul, the entire point of freedom as a Christ follower is to exercise it for the sake of other people. God did not call the church or Christ followers to win the culture war. He did not call us to win the next election. The only winning we do is in the sense of winning souls. And that's not even up to us. That's up to God and the Holy Spirit. I wonder if instead of being preoccupied with saving America, or defending my rights, or defending church rights, we were preoccupied with other people and defending theirs. You know, during the pandemic, so many churches were bombastic, in your face, in defense of their rights. And even if their theology was correct, which was debatable a lot of the times, their posture and their tone and their approach said that it was less about others and more about winning. By the way, do you know what that looks like when it is? Look at the last line here. He says, by the way, if you do this, if you bite and devour each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. Tell me, who bites each other? Literally, who bites? Children. Do you see what Paul's saying? If you're going to act like a baby in this, it's going to cost you. And it's going to cost the people around you. It's what's going to destroy you as Jesus followers. Stop doing that. You don't need to. Use your freedom for other people. Tim Keller said this. When the church as a whole is no longer seen as speaking to questions that transcend politics, and when it is no longer united by a common faith that transcends politics, then the world sees strong evidence that Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx were right, that religion is really just a cover for people wanting to get their way in the world. My goal is not to get under your skin, but I wonder if you feel a little unsettled like I do. That's okay. We live in a world of polarizing views, right? You know this. You've heard this. There's only two buckets for anything. It's either right or left. You're pro or you're anti. You're Republican or you're Democrat, unless you're libertarian. That's a whole different story, okay? Everything seems to go in two buckets. I'm either tolerant or I'm intolerant. I'm accepting or I'm a bigot. But you guys, you're too smart for that. You know that it doesn't work like that. And here's the thing. You will never find Jesus in the extremes. It doesn't work that way. He never did. Do you realize he spent his entire life in ministry navigating the road between the temple and religious demands of the Jews and the empire demands of the Romans? Instead, he just lived full of truth and full of grace, demonstrating what the law of Christ looked like. So, in the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at, not necessarily in this order, marriage and family. We're going to look at the value of life. We're going to look at racial issues. We're going to look at the environmental issues. And we're going to look at sexuality. I don't want to preach any of these, by the way, just so you know. But we're going to talk about them. And as we do, here's what we're going to do. Each week, we're going to unpack two pieces to this. We're going to unpack, first of all, what is the heart of God on this topic? Because remember, we're not looking at just all the laws, all the rules, all those things. That's what we tend to default to. But God's called us to more than that. So what we want to do is say, what's the heart of God towards this topic? What is his design? What is his passion for this? Right? Because we want truth. We want to have the right truth that shapes our worldview. But that's only question number one. And then the second question is, okay, if that's the heart of God, but our posture and our tone matter, how do we then engage with our neighbors, our friends, our culture, our kids, our parents in relation to that issue? Because we want our worldview to line up with the law of Christ. We want to be people, in the end, that reflect the heart of the Father to a chaotic world. So my goal in this series is for us together to take a look at the worldviews we have, be honest and humble enough to know that they changed, that we're not even consistent, and that it didn't all come from the right place. It came out of our history and our baggage. And how do we more closely align our worldview to the law of Christ so that we reflect God's heart and his passion to the world that so desperately needs it?